Hello, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel from Media Ops, and you're watching a live roundtable edition of DevOps Unbound. DevOps Unbound is our bi-weekly video series where we delve into relevant topics around DevOps. It is sponsored by our friends at Tricentis, and we thank them very much for sponsoring today's event. While most of our DevOps Unbound episodes are recorded and broadcast over the TechStrong TV network, once a month we do a live roundtable where we ask usually friends to come in and talk about a great topic relevant to DevOps, and today is no different. But though our friends online here, are the panel members, what really makes these roundtables are you, our audience. These roundtables are as good as your involvement is. So on that note, let me introduce you to our webinar platform, which is called Big Marker. No web, no plugins, no downloads. You're right here in your web browser for most of you. And it's very easy to use. I want to direct your attention, though, to what we call the communications module, which is for most of you is a white module on the right side of your screen. On top, it'll say chat, Q&A, polls, handouts. And that's how you're going to interact today with our audience. I see some of us have already put into the public. Well, Jane and Grohl and Jane, all our panel members have said hello. And then we have other folks jumping in and saying hello and where they're from. And, one of them, it's like magic to me, is when I look on the internet and people say where they're logging in from, and I realize they're not just in my neighborhood or not just even in my state or my country, but they're from all over the world. So please feel free to log in, say hello, mention where you're from, and we thank you for joining. To ask questions, to participate in this roundtable, that public chat is a great way of doing it, but keep in mind when you put it out there, you may get an answer from another attendee. You may get an answer from one of our panel members, or you may not get an answer at all. It's in the public chat, and it's out there. Another way of interacting with us is the Q&A section. So if you see where it says chat, right to the right of that, it says Q&A. And if you go in there and ask a question, well, those will be questions that go strictly to me, actually, and I will ask our panel members. So in this way, our hope is that you, the audience, will drive the direction and topics that we discuss under the broader topic of what we have in store today, which of course is DevOps and SRE. If not, we're prepared to talk on what we want to talk about, but we want to make sure we talk about what you want to hear about and maybe answer questions and everything you may have. All right. So that being said, I mentioned just a bit ago that today's roundtable is on SRE. And for those of you not familiar with the term SRE, it's Site Reliability Engineering, and DevOps. And, as the founder of DevOps.com, I've been dealing with DevOps for 8+ years now. And SRE has not been around that long. SRE is probably, since the Google book came out, it was probably 3-4 years ago now. But it's made a huge impact, right? And at some level, SRE and DevOps are not mutually exclusive. Some may say they are. We'll talk about that. But they both have the goal of empowering our IT teams to do more, better, faster, right? More secure. And we're going to talk about where SRE and DevOps sort of converge and where they diverge. To do so now, let me introduce you to our panel today. So first of all, I'm really happy to welcome back to our webinar stage an old friend of us here at Media Ops and DevOps Institute, and that's Sam Fell, who's with Sumo Logic. Sam's a surprise guest. You may not have seen him on the blurbs for the promos, but
I'm bombing your Unbound.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sam, thanks for joining us.
Good to have you, Sam.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yep. And then the lady in the middle is my partner and friend, Jane Grohl, who's the CEO and founder of DevOps Institute. Jane, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
And of course, we should mention DevOps Institute also has an SRE certification.
Two, actually. Yep, two.
Yep.
SRE Foundation and SRE Practitioner. But thank you, Alan.
And then last but not least, our friend Kurt Chase, who's coming to us today from his country fishing station.
Fishing paradise, that's right.
Yeah, but Kurt is with Tricentis. Well, he's with Tricentis now. He has a lifelong career in technology and applications and so forth, and he tells us more about that. And has dealt with virtually all aspects of IT. Kurt, welcome.
Thank you.
And then last but not least is my co-host here on DevOps Unbound. He's also the CTO at MediaOps and the founder CEO at Accelerated Strategies Group, a research analysis firm, Mitchell Ashley. Hey, Mitchell, welcome.
Hey, Alan. Good to have this great panel with us, and they're all friends as well as cohorts.
Absolutely. So, guys, I really feel that in order to have an intelligent discussion here on SRE and DevOps and where they work together and where they don't, we first have to have a better understanding, or at least a level setting, of what that SRE role is. Right? I've spent 7 years banging my head on the wall of what DevOps is. Right, Jane? Remember those days when everybody was so, well, what exactly is DevOps? There's no definition. How come there's no definition? SRE, well, there was a book written and everything else. I think we have maybe it's a more fungible, more something you get our heads wrapped around. But Jane, if you don't mind, you guys have kind of written the course. You've got the certifications, 2 of them. Why don't we start off with that? What do we mean when we say SRE like this?
So if you don't mind, let me give you a 2-second history lesson, because I think it's really interesting here. So first of all, I think everybody has to understand that SRE did not grow up inside of DevOps. It actually was a separate initiative born out of some practices exercised at Google. And the Google team just celebrated 5 years since the SRE book was released, right? So if you looked at the origins of DevOps, which preceded this, first we had agile for software development. Let's go faster. Let's go smaller, right? Let's, kind of pass that downstream. And then the second part of the continuum was the introduction of DevOps. Let's introduce a lot of automation. Let's look at breaking down monolithic applications. Let's look at what happens after the code comes out of the development teams. And then DevOps celebrated at deployment. So whether it was continuous delivery or continuous deployment, we all, kind of celebrated the fact that the code went into production and then the cycle started again. And people like me that came from operations kind of went, well, now what? Right? Now that the code is in production or the application is out there, what now? During that same period of time, Google starts, this effort under SRE that says this is what happens when operations is designed by software engineers. So the focus on operations, on reliability, on post-production, pre-production work, but post-production resilience and reliability was kind of that third piece of the agile DevOps and now operational contingency. So I think the three together really form, right, the puzzle that could be part of the value stream or however you want to do that. Site reliability engineer focuses on operations, but has a very strong role pre-production, right? So site reliability engineers are engineers, right? They have skills to be able to do troubleshooting. They're advisors and members of the agile teams. Some come from the development side of the house, right? Again, number one skill when you interview people is like Python, right? But there's a lot of automation that's associated with it. Some come from the operational space, right? So it's an evolution of operations. If we're going to shift everything left, then SRE has to be involved very early in the cycle and continue all the way through, so that reliability, right, usability of what's happening in the software development lifecycle actually is realized when we get into production and beyond. So it's a little bit of a history lesson, but I think it's important to understand that they didn't grow up together, but the convergence is tremendous, right? That they both have the same goal, and again, they're sort of outposts of Agile in some ways.
If I could, one thing to overlay on top of that, Jane, is at the same time, if we look at how the infrastructure developed, from on-prem and PC to cloud, I think that is a forcing function on these roles as well, too. Making cloud resources so accessible for everyone, so easy for people to, set up their environments. I think that was a big part of that, too, that history along the way, the infrastructure behind it.
Absolutely.
So Jane, you touched on a couple things that are interesting. One is the automation piece in Python. And so my understanding is that one of the tenets of being an SRE is to automate stuff, right? You should be spending less than 50% of your time doing work and 50% of your time doing automation to automate work that you're doing. And so that seems very much developer-esque, right? I remember fellow from Forrester standing up on stage the first year of the DevOps Enterprise Summit saying, if you have administrator or administer in your name of your job, you should start looking for another job. You should start looking into being an engineer. Looking at things is different than doing something with those things. And so I think to me, that's where the SRE bit comes in, where you're not just looking at infrastructure and how it's behaving and observing it. You're really in there trying to help set the table for the product that you see coming. And then the other part of that I think is really interesting, where I think DevOps and SRE have a bit of a dynamic tension, which is good dynamic tension, is that the SREs they're trying to slow down necessarily. They're the brake on that fast pace of innovation. Otherwise, the DevOps team would be like, I'm just going to ship this and just see if it works. I'm going to just ship this and see if it works. I'm going to just ship this and see if it works. And eventually, you have to have something in production that says, hey, guess what? I can't accept 60,000 changes every day. We need to have a different process, or we need to have something in place so that I can ensure the reliability of the systems that we're pumping all this stuff into. And so I think go ahead, Mitch. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say what's interesting about that, Sam, and Jane, you were talking about they didn't grow up together. If you remember back to the early days of DevOps, the mantra then was, well, we're not going to need operations. Developers are going to do that.
No ops.
Right.
Yeah, no ops. And anybody that's been around ops said, well, I don't believe that, but I'm probably going to be doing some different roles. And obviously now SRE is one of them.
Yep.
And, some scripting skills, you could say whether Python is coding or not, you're doing different things than you might be doing in an application, but you might be doing some of the same things. So it's interesting that as we automate the pipeline to deployment, now we've automated the operations for how we manage that, but also how we improve the operations of it, which is a tenet of DevOps and Agile, which is continuous, not just innovation, but continuous improvement.
Yeah, and if I can just feed on something that you've all said, a lot of it is very, very human efforts towards automation. So one of the key concepts in SRE is the reduction of toil, right? Everybody knows what toil is. It makes you want to groan because it's all that manual work. But and the proactive nature of SRE, I think, is very different and really empowers people to take a proactive approach to reducing toil by automation. Right, by identifying automation opportunities for consistency, for stability, and all of that. But the other piece of it I think is really fascinating is, Agile was a self-regulating system. DevOps is supposed to be a self-regulating system. And SRE is a self-regulating system. So introducing concepts like error budgets instead of formal change management, looking at things like managing to service level objectives that everybody shares an accountability for, right? So it isn't just the developers have metrics and, everybody shares something, I think creates a very human centric, role with a whole heck of a lot of automation associated with
outcome centric, right? If the SRE's got an error budget and they're getting to the end of that error budget, then they have to have a conversation with the folks on the dev side and say, hey, listen, I can't keep changing things every 5 minutes because what we've been doing has sort of been breaking my error budget. And as a business, that's not good. So either we need to fix the upstream stuff or you just need to stop until I get a new budget.
So let me weigh in here. In some ways, I do see a lot of parallels, though, between SRE and DevOps in terms of how they're adopted by organizations. I used to say with DevOps came to organizations in bubbles. Like if you're ever a kid blowing bubbles. When you go to a large organization, it wouldn't be a DevOps, as far as the eye can see, like Buzz and Woody and that meme. It would take place in pockets in an organization. This team would adopt sort of a DevOps way of doing things. And then another team, and then another team, and eventually
Very hard to scale that, yeah.
Right. But eventually those teams would come together, much like when bubbles join and you get a bigger bubble. I think it's the same thing with SREs. Someone in the audience put that into their comment, that they're just starting to do SRE within their team, and they're hoping that to take that to the wider organization, right? Mm-hmm. I think in terms of how do organizations adopt SRE, metrics, SLOs versus SLAs, stuff like that. It's very bubbly. It's very piecemeally, right? It takes time for an organization to go all in, on DevOps, to go all in on SREs.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you start small, you have some wins. And I think on some levels, the DevOps SRE role is one and the same at a small scale. You have to do it all at that level and then just build upon those successes. And there was one, I forget the name of the author about, a bright spot. I think you have to develop that, get the first CI/CD pipeline going, show the value, and then grow it from there. I think that makes a lot of sense. And for me, at a very, very high level, when I think of DevOps and SRE, I think of two words right off the bat. I think of development. When I think of DevOps, I think they're a bit closer to development of the product, the features that customers run. When I think of SREs, I think of the site, the operational platform that runs on, the development that was done. That's how I separate the roles at a very high level, but I think there is a lot of overlap in the roles as well, to your point, Alan. I think it especially at smaller scales, I think they can be one and the same role, I believe.
I think there's some even more dimensions to that, Kurt, to expand on what you're saying, because it's almost inevitable that SRE or something like it was created, because as we're creating software more rapidly, as we have dynamic environments, we move to infrastructure as code. Everything is fluid and everything is getting faster. So guess what? You can't keep up pace with manual efforts, right? So it makes sense that SRE, kind of happened in its own way, but also for some of the same reasons that DevOps happened, for some of those same conditions.
And to the point that Jane was making about making it at a human scale, I think the idea of SLI, SLO, error budgets, these are KPIs or things that folks can align around. Right. And because DevOps and SRE, these things are so nebulous. Landscape, the system that people are working on and managing, there's so many things for that one person or that group of people to try and take advantage of or to have responsibility for. Giving them, boiling that down into something that everyone can look at across the whole organization and say, okay, this system has this, right, these parameters that we need to try and maintain. That helps to make the system easier to comprehend and easier to communicate to other people about what you need.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have a question about the overlap in automation, and I think all of these things exist in every organization today, right? Whether you do change management through ITIL or you do builds or you do, however you do testing or whatever, all of that exists today. And between DevOps and SRE, what we're doing is reshaping, to Mitch's point, because we have to go faster, right? And so the world has changed. We can't have 18-month cycles anymore. I mean, there's a lot that's changed, but all of these capabilities already exist. It's really re-engineering, no pun, right? Some of these capabilities, some of these processes, and bringing in automation. And to the question about, automation, what I think is really interesting is because we've been so siloed in the past, developers had whatever tools they were using, and then, testers had whatever tools they were using, and there's vocabulary, and it's like it's like adjacent countries, right? Where you don't speak the same language, you don't have the same customs, you don't have the same capabilities. And I think DevOps and SRE are bringing us together. I mean, Sam, to your point about SLOs and SLIs, it's an accountability, both as a team, as an organization, but also as an individual, which means we need to have transparency into the automation. We need to agree together on, what tools make sense, so that the bottleneck is not because you have your favorite and I have my favorite, and so it's hopefully there's some kind of a collaborative culture. The challenge, I think, is that the expectation of one SRE per dev team is the ratios aren't there and can't be. And I know a lot of organizations have asked that question. How many SREs should we have? Should we have one per agile team? So we can embed them. Can we do it in multiples? I don't know if anybody's asked that question, but I think it's an interesting one as well.
Speaking of questions, over in the Q&A, it's more of a statement, but it poses a question. It comes from Jonathan Gelber. And Jonathan has a strong development background, then moved into production support, doing app support, doing several things. And when, in Jonathan's mind, this stuff we're talking about to describe what the SRE role is and how they interact with the team. I think he said it well. Sounds like old wine in a new bottle, right? Sounds like too much of an overlap between application production support and a highly collaborative DevOps environment. And you tell the difference between application support engineers and SREs.
One topic and in the chat also, I know Sandeep raised a question saying, is the main overlap automation? And I think there's a ton of overlaps. And I brought this up, after Jane provided the history lesson. I think the infrastructure, and especially the cloud infrastructure, AWS, Azure, they have driven a lot of this, and that's one area where, for me at least, top of mind, as I said, is cloud cost containment. Having easy access to infrastructure to spin it up, keep it running. If you're not managing that, you will get killed. And so that's a key area where I think DevOps and SREs have to collaborate together. There's huge overlap. That immediately becomes a problem as soon as you start to move SaaS products online, and scale those up and out. You need to deal with that. And I think that's a key overlap. At least for me, that's top of mind. I worry about that. I worry about the budget overruns there, et cetera. So I think there's tons of places where they overlap. And I agree with Jonathan. I think the application production support of old, that is kind of, we could almost say that was early SREs, in the early days.
But there's a tendency to take things we've done before and say, well, this is the same thing.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the principles, the idea of it may be very similar, if not exactly the same, but we're applying it in a different environment in a different way. And the analogy I would make is, early on, it was pretty common for people to say, well, the cloud is just other people's computers. It kind of was in the beginning, but once you really figured out what you could do differently in the cloud that you couldn't do in a fixed, locked-in data center, then you realize, no, the cloud's really different. It's a lot more than just, and that's kind of what SRE is about. It is those things that Jonathan mentioned, but it's also a lot more because you're having to manage a very complex environment and delivery of software on a very rapid pace.
And we have to correct, it's not Jonathan, it's Shob who's asking under Jonathan.
Yes, I apologize.
Jonathan,
but good question, Shob. Good question.
You do give out Amazon gift cards to 4 lucky winners. If Jonathan wins, does Shob get the gift card?
I don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think the panel is going to go for that. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll have to talk about it.
But let's go back to the roles for just a minute, if you don't mind, because I think that Shob asked a really interesting question. So several roles, right? Is it an application support engineer or an SRE? You pick, right? I mean, it's really a way of thinking as much as whatever the title is too, right? And so application support, in my experience, I come from ops, were the folks waiting on the other side of the fence to catch whatever was pushed into production, right? Whatever was shipped. Maybe we had some relationship pre-production. Maybe we got involved in testing towards the end, but weren't really engaged earlier in the cycle. So is an application support engineer an SRE? Sure. As an SRE, if you start to adapt the principles and your teams and your organization start to internalize that, can you engage earlier so that you can look at reliability way before we're at that push, right? When we're ready to ship, which sometimes is just too late, right? Systems administrators, application support engineers, level 2, level 3 support individuals, software engineers, these are all really great candidates for starting to take on an SRE role, whether it's a title or whether it's not. I think that when we're looking to scale, we don't say, well, this is the thing. We ran into that with DevOps too, where everybody suddenly became a DevOps engineer, right? And sometimes self-identifying is a way of self-actualizing. But I think that with SRE, all of these important capabilities, whether you're an infrastructure engineer, an application support engineer, level 2, level 3, it really does reshape how we think, how we behave, and I think most importantly, how we engage.
Let me go back to another Q&A here from the audience on a similar topic, something we touched on a little bit. And that is, Adam states, to increase scale of product release automation, do you feel that SREs are best structured as part of the quote-unquote SRE team, as part of the SE team,
Software engineering,
SREs, right? So embedded SREs within software engineers, or as a separate standalone SRE team?
Alan, someone earlier posted something about, is SRE day 2 DevOps?
Right. Yeah, there was a message.
Kind of a similar flavor to this question. I think you could look at it as, is SRE truly embedded in the software engineering team, a part of issuing a release or a deploy? Maybe not. But I think it's more of that day 2 DevOps of, okay, it's in production. Now what?
Thoughts on that, Jane, Sam, Kurt?
I would tell you, I'm not a fan of separate teams, except in certain situations. I think it creates more of a divisiveness. But as I said before, we don't have the ratios, right? So having one SRE embedded into an agile team is very costly and hasn't been proven. Having an SRE responsible for a product or a service or a feature set or something like that makes some sense. Now, in the Google books, they do talk about SRE teams, because once things go into production, there are likely going to be teams that are responsible for reliability across a portfolio or across, however the clusters work. And so that probably does make some sense. But the whole concept of project management office being like an SRE office, it becomes very isolated, and we don't achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve, which is more engagement earlier and whatever. Just to throw one more thing in, I think it's interesting because it really didn't gain a lot of traction. Google also defined other levels of RE. So they came up with a network reliability engineer and a customer reliability engineer. Those haven't really gained a whole lot of traction, but maybe that's part of the answer to this question. When you start to look at SREs, depending on what they're responsible for, and you start to, kind of break it out. We just don't want to play the name game. I think the name game is really, really dangerous.
That makes
a reliability engineer sounds interesting. I don't know what that would. You're making the customers reliable. That sounds like a really good business model.
I 100% agree, Jane. I think the less silos you create, the more people can be connected. And it goes back to the whole SOO, SOI. Those are really taking SLA and humanizing them, and I think the more you can keep that human chain connected and in the loop, the better off you'll be. It's extremely difficult. There's a question from Mick about 300 different development teams at Humana. That's huge. It's that scale. It's very difficult to stay coordinated. It becomes a huge challenge to stay coordinated. And I think that's why I'm with you. I prefer not to have too many teams. It's one team. We're all trying to achieve the same objectives.
I also
And
like
maybe the SRE is the glue. Sorry.
Yeah,
No,
part
go
of it.
ahead.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, part of that. I agree. Yeah, I would say
I
that's.
was thinking the kind of loosely coupled definition of DevOps, right? There's no manifesto. This is what it is.
Mhm.
And even though we have the Google books for SRE, everybody's environment is different, and their, how they think about solving problems is, how this kind of their DNA. And I think the
Yeah.
adaptability of SRE is still wide open. You can call it what you want, right? Here are the things that we do, and you want to put, an extra character at the letter at the end of it, and have it focus on something else. Great. That's what you can do. That's the brilliance of it.
And one thing that I really love is and I say this when we do recruiting a lot, is that, if you're a software engineer, great. Anyone can write C++, C#, Python code. It takes a special individual to be able to write code, diagnose a network problem, troubleshoot a hardware problem, troubleshoot a packet delivery problem. That becomes very interesting. I think the skill set, it's really changed. I remember back in the days at Autodesk shipping AutoCAD releases, we had distinct developer teams, the release engineering team, and that has all been blurred now, with all the changes we've seen, both with the roles, the infrastructure, and how customers uptake our services and use our products. Another interesting point for me nowadays is, back in the days of shipping AutoCAD, when we shipped shrink wrap software, we ran into issues where customers didn't want to upgrade. They would upgrade every 2 years. And so at the speed of cloud now, are we going to get into a situation where customers are like, that's enough, turn those feature flags off. We're not ready to uptake that new capability in your service. I think that's an interesting dynamic that we're probably hitting on some levels with some customers, with large installations of SAP, ServiceNow, et cetera. But that's something that I have my eye on to see how that develops in this new SaaS world, if you will.
Absolutely. There's another story that a good friend of a few of ours here, Anders Wahlgren, told me about an interaction he had with some folks at Google. And they had a service level agreement in place for an API call that was being widely used inside of the company. And because they were performing so well, they were way, way ahead of that service level. So the response time was much faster than they anticipated. So people started to depend on the actual performance and not wait for what the SLO was and say, okay, I'm allowed to wait this amount of time for that response. And they started to have problems upstream because they were expecting this kind of performance from a system. And so they said, hey, guess what? The engineers went in and changed their system so that even if they could respond faster than the service level agreement was, they would not. Right? So they throttled their service to make sure that they were perfectly in compliant with their SLA. And that is an interesting thing, because it means that going either being better or worse than the expected performance can cause problems in a large, complex, you don't know what people are going to do with your system. And a non-deterministic system, it's very, very complicated.
You said the C word too. I think compliance is another area that drives these roles together, and they have to collaborate.
But just to throw, sorry, Alan.
No,
I was
go
going to say,
Jane.
just to throw a wrench in, I think it's very important for anybody listening to understand that while SRE is gaining a lot of attention, it is not a replacement for DevOps. It's not a competition. Do you do DevOps or SRE, right? And I think that, because we're so enamored with things that are new, it could be perceived that, SRE is better than DevOps, or DevOps is better than SRE, or you only need one of them. And that's untrue, right? You need a value stream that has DevOps and DevOps roles and DevOps automation and CI/CD and release engineering, but you also need, this reliability operational focus. And I think it's really important that people come away from this not thinking that one is better than the other or one replaces the other. I don't know what you guys think.
I definitely agree. It isn't versus, it's how they work together.
That's right. Yeah. It's all about silos.
And Sandeep asked a great question here. What kind of enterprises need SREs? When do you start to say we need a team, or we need a group of people focused on the reliability. And I think the answer to this question is that there's a lot of dependencies here. How big is your application? How big is your infrastructure, the site you're running, as far as the pure number you need? But again, I think it almost starts with a single role, in the DevOps SRE. And then as you grow, you have to start to separate them as your production instance grows, your customer base grows, et cetera. That's when I think you really have to start to mature those roles. And the separations become a little bit more clear, I think, as well, too. In addition, the overlaps as well as you scale up.
Sandeep asks a question about this. It seems like what kind of enterprises need SREs? Those that have over hundreds of releases a day. I don't know that there's a metric necessarily for that. Just on personal example, we have SRE on our team, Greg, who, by the way, went through the DevOps Institute certification and got a lot out of it. It's very helpful. And, there are a lot of things you can do in the SRE world. It can be working on technical debt. It can be working on performance improvements. It can be working on scaling, not for where you are now, but where you're going to be down the road. It can be tuning databases and optimization, things that you're doing to improve site reliability, performance, et cetera. And, we're a small team. We're not hundreds of people. We're not even dozens of people. We're just a handful of folks on my engineering team. So it can be, a 3 or 4 person team that has somebody that's working on SRE.
I don't disagree. Jane, question or statement, whatever you want to call it, came in. It was from our friend Mick here. And he says, it feels to him that the real competition in the future is between SRE and ITIL, not SRE and DevOps. As an ITIL.
That's my favorite question.
Yeah, I thought this was in your wheelhouse. Go ahead.
It's a perfect question for Jane.
Yeah,
it is. So thank you. I'll pass you the little VIG afterwards. So if you read the Google books, and by the way, you're not Google, right? So please, don't come away from this thinking that, everything in the Google book is well, that was one of the problems with ITIL. ITIL became very religious where, you almost had to sing a hymn before you opened up the book to figure out what you should do next. And we don't want that with SRE. But SRE in the early parts of the first SRE book, SRE is very, very clear that it is a service management framework. And so it is, in my mind, has a lot of the same processes as a traditional IT service management, whether ITIL or not, change management, incident management, troubleshooting, problem management, capacity management, availability management, really traditional ITIL processes. But it adapts it more closely to the faster, more rapid deployment model. So I think that SRE is a more modern version of service management that can be integrated with DevOps and with Agile and with value stream management. Now, is it better? That's for anyone to say. But the problem with traditional ITIL is change management, right? So organizations adopted ITIL, so you had to put in a request for change 2 weeks in advance, and it had to go to a change advisory board, and then maybe you got an approval. Here, as others were saying, you get an error budget, right? You get an error budget that it allows you to deploy at will as long as you stay within the error budget. So SRE is managing services, right? Managing services mean we manage it, pre-production and post-production. Incident management, how SRE defines incident response, particularly if you're waking in the middle of the night. SREs talk a lot about, what happens at the 3 o'clock in the morning call. Capacity management, right? Provisioning, things like that. So you're right. I think that the loyalists, and I come from the ITIL space. I spent 15 years teaching ITIL. Again, in its day, I think it really helped organizations wrap around a lot of these processes. But I do think that SRE gives you a much more modern perspective on how to handle these things, whether you call it
helps humans sort of make sense of all this complexity. And I love that we've boiled it down to more simple, not 18 volumes of stuff. That's one of the things that I really love about DevOps is it's just so obvious, right? Agile and DevOps. These aren't complicated concepts to say, oh, smaller batches, faster, so you get more feedback. That seems kind of logical. I don't need to read 18 volumes of a pink thingamajob to know that makes sense.
Well, and I also think we struggle with framework wars. So I'll just throw that out there for conversation where we love our frameworks in IT. You know, I always say my husband's an accountant. They have one, right? Generally accepted accounting principles. Maybe someday we'll get there. But, you know, I think a risk to SRE and DevOps is loyalty to other frameworks.
Yeah. But even
where you have this
generally accepted. You know.
Well, exactly. So anyhow, I'll leave it there and thank you for the question, but I'll let the rest of the panel weigh in on it.
Absolutely. Panel, you want to weigh in on it, or because there's a ton of activity here in the.
I love Sandeep's next question about enterprises that are still on-prem.
I was going to go to that one too.
SRE role for them, you know, and for me,
is there an SRE role in on-prem, or does it?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
Most likely, if you're running on-prem, you have designs on, you know, the digital transformation moving to the cloud, and so I think it's critical to have an SRE type role early on, who can not only help you, you know, manage what you're running in the enterprise for your company, but also help with that transition to the cloud, undoubtedly, that you're going to be faced with in the next several years. So I think it's important to have that role, even in the enterprise, if you're just running enterprise software right now, that will eventually move to the cloud. I think that's critical.
Agreed. Jonathan, I don't know if it's Jonathan or Jonathan's alter ego now, because the real Jonathan has questions.
He's really here too, yeah.
Right.
Is it really those two?
So he agrees that ITIL offers challenges to newer processes, but is it hard to get IT organizations to mind shift away from it? And that is the real Jonathan, by the way.
So again, if you don't mind, let me chime in, because I think the heartbeat here is change management. Right. So all the other stuff is important and interesting and whatever. But, you know, organizations spent a long time investing in these, you know, fairly detailed change management processes as a result of GRC, right? Governance, risk, and compliance, and internal audits, and proving you had the controls in place. And so the shift away to kind of what we'll call a trust algorithm, where you're trusting that this error budget is still going to prove controls and still going to prove that you've got, you know, it's not the Wild West or all of that. What I think what's missed here is that you don't recognize that the automation provides a lot of evidence of control, right? So when you're working with error budgets and you have very pervasive automation, the evidence that it's consistent, that you're doing it the same way all the time, and therefore the trust algorithm actually can be deployed, but it is a different mind shift. I mean, change advisory boards were like the Star Trek councils, where you had to put in a 4-page request for change 2 weeks in advance, regardless of the change. And there was, you know, however many people were making a decision, usually those further away from the development. And again, they got used to that. So break that down, right? Realize that there's probably some changes that don't need to do that, and you could build an error budget for. And ones that have higher risk or higher impact, maybe they stay with the change advisory board until the trust algorithm is proven. So it's not an either or, but it is really more about change management in a modern world than anything else, I think.
And a part of that, Jane, is getting the data. You're running experiments. DevOps is about running experiments in a cheap and repeatable fashion. And so running an experiment is only useful if you understand what the outcome of the experiment was. And the faster with anything, if you get faster feedback on your builds, you get better product. If you get faster feedback on your deploys, you get better product, and you get better reliability, and you get better lots of different things. And so the better able you're to sort of understand what's happening at the outcome of these experiments that you're running, the faster you can bring that information back, the better that continuous cycle is going to be across all the different parts of that life cycle, I think.
The other thing, back to Mick's point about IT, I think we do have an interesting dynamic now where IT is actually adopting some of the DevOps principles and practices and, be it CI/CD. I know of multiple IT teams that are looking at that as a way to keep, all the applications they run for the business updated. They have CI/CD pipelines when they do their updates. So I think we're seeing some of that bleed over into the IT space as well, some of the best practices, especially if the IT team is involved in running the production, SaaS services that you're providing as your product. They definitely become very, very familiar with DevOps, SRE in that role as well, not just what they need to operate for the corporation.
I was just chatting with one of our attendees, and that person works for an IT services organization, and they mentioned that SRE is coming up a lot with their customers. So it's sort of not a fringe or edge condition. I think a lot of organizations are looking at SRE and trying to understand how they might leverage it, how it might apply to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it is driven by the digital transformation. I think a lot of these organizations are still pushing to, AWS, Azure, and as soon as they get there, they're like, oh my God, who knows about this stuff here? I think that's a big forcing function still, and it's going to be with us for a while, I believe.
Yeah, the faster you can break down silos, align people on KPIs, and get that feedback, those are the critical things, I think, for DevOps and SRE.
Yeah, and I think some of it's vocabulary, right? So we're talking about SLOs and SLIs and really trying to get service level objectives, right? There's a difference between that and SLAs. SLAs were all about the signature, right? Like, hey, I need you and I to sit across with our lawyers and sign an SLA. Or it was all about what happens when something breaks. Oh, we'll fix it in 2 hours, as opposed to, what is the availability, the capacity. So I think it's also embracing a common vocabulary. I mean, with all due respect, let's stop talking about KPIs. Let's start talking about SLOs, right? Let's start talking about, the indicators and start to really kind of, even as a first step, right? Let's just start saying the same thing and speaking the same language, because once you cross that chasm, the rest of it gets a whole lot easier. So, and again, KPIs are important. So Sam, please don't misunderstand that. But I think it is something that we need to be able to just bring a different approach. And again, sometimes if we say the same thing, we speak the same language, it gets us there.
Agreed.
Guys, I need to take a quick time out. I wanted to announce the 4 Amazon gift card winners before I forget, as I've done in the past. The 4 winners of the Amazon gift cards today are Mario E., Sudan S., Edward M., and Dave C. So congratulations to the 4 of you.
Congrats.
Yep, our team will be reaching out and emailing you your Amazon gift cards, and thanks for participating today. But really, thanks to so many. I mean, Mick and Sandeep and the 2 Jonathans and everyone else who asked questions today.
Great questions.
Great stuff. Guys, we're coming up, though, 10 minutes from here, and I wanted to give each of you kind of a chance to, put the cherry on the sundae for yourselves in terms of what we've talked about today. And you know what, Kurt? I think you went last. So I'm going to ask you to go first, if you don't mind, and kind of, what do you want people to take away after the discussion in light of what we've discussed? What would be your parting comments?
Yeah, I think there are definitely 2 distinct roles. There's a lot that goes into defining, individual needs for corporations and businesses. There's so many things to take into account: the size of the site you're going to be running, the applications you're providing, the markets you serve. I think another forcing function, in addition to infrastructure and cloud and all those new things, is all the compliance requirements, all the attacks we're seeing, all the security controls. Those aren't getting reduced, they're increasing. And I think DevOps and SRE are critical roles to help make sure all those things come together and stay together all along the pipelines and all along the delivery of the services to your customers. So And as I said at the beginning, for me, when I think about these roles, when I think about DevOps, the first thing I think about is development, that they're doing more on the development side, if you will, before they get to the operational side. And site reliability is all about the systems that are running and making sure that those are fully automated and resilient and cost efficient and things like that, compliant, secure, all those things. There's a lot to do there. And what you need as an individual company, it depends on where you are in the maturity and your life cycle and your digital transformation, et cetera. But you will most likely need both roles at some point, for sure.
Absolutely. Before I ask the next person, Jane, I noticed Judy Sanker comment.
Judy Sanker, yeah.
Is our Judy Sanker that we know? Or what's
Well, it's my Judy Sanker that I know.
Okay. I know the name, but thanks for joining. Sam, let me ask you to wrap up.
Thanks, Alan. So I think the most important thing that I heard was really just about trying to, again, eliminate those silos between the different teams. Even though they are separate, aligning them with SLOs, SLIs,
KPIs,
right?
SLAs, yeah.
Right. I mean, making these, there's so much complexity out there, and automation and AI, and things happen that people don't know about, and new systems are put in, and ephemeral systems disappear. And finding a structure, a framework that you can have everyone agree on, that has the basis of it is the best outcome for your company, for your organization, let me put it that way, I think is an important thing to get to. And the structures, the DevOps and the SRE structures, those frameworks are designed to help people get to those. And they do it by helping people work together more effectively. And I think that's really what it's all about.
Fair. Jane, what about you?
So my advice was, don't get lost in the complexity. DevOps and SRE have pretty common principles, right? Let's make tomorrow better than today by optimizing automation. Let's let teams be self-regulating. Let's manage to service level objectives or common accountabilities, right? And more importantly, let's increase our time to market and maintain or increase our quality. So those are very, very simple human principles. How you do that, right, can be as complex or as simple as you want. Right. Sam brought up the proactive nature of the SRE. Be curious, right? Read the books, go to a SRE Foundation certification, attend panels like this. Be curious. Don't get stuck on the name, right? Don't get stuck on the framework. Be curious, because there's some really cool stuff in DevOps. There's really cool stuff in SRE. And so I think individually and organizationally, I think it's just time to experiment and explore.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Mitchell, you want to bring it home?
You bet. Well, I love our panel today. Thank you all. Yours is fantastic. I'm really encouraged by this, by the attendance on this roundtable, by the conversation, and by the engagement by the audience. And what it makes me think of is, I think we now have a way that we can break out and are breaking out of the throw it over the wall days, right? And operations, if you want to use that as the term of where we might house SRE, has a way to grab a hold and create their own destiny. And that's one of the things that I think SRE is it isn't just accept whatever comes over. It's, I'm part of the chain here. I'm part of the process here. And I just don't have to sort of put bubble gum and, baling wire on it, duct tape to keep the thing running. It's really about, how we make all of it better, what's delivered into production and beyond. So I think that's hugely positive. And I hope that people that are looking into SRE or engaging in starting that path, read the book, take certifications like from DevOps Institute. Those are great places to start. Again, it's not a dogmatic framework. It's not something that is fixed. It's something you can take the principles of, like DevOps, and apply to your job or your team or your organization. And that's the beauty of it. And that way you get to create your own future. And that could be a very bright future for everyone.
Yeah, definitely.
Good point.
Very good.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So, panel, thank you so much for another fantastic DevOps Unbound roundtable. Thank you so much to Tricentis and all the folks there for their sponsorship of DevOps Unbound, both the roundtables and the bi-weekly video series. You can catch them on TechStrong TV. You can catch past episodes on DevOps.com as well as DigitalAnarchist.com. Most of all, though, thanks to our audience. I think we had something 450 registrations today. I don't know how many live. I didn't look at the number yet, but it's the people like the Mitches and the Sandeeps and the Jonathans and so forth of the world. A lesson we've learned, Mitchell, Jane knows this, they've done a few of them with me, Kurt. These roundtables are as good as the audience. No matter how good our panel is, they're only as good as the audience. So thank you so much, audience, for being here today and participating. We do appreciate it. We'll see you in about another 2 weeks for the next episode of DevOps Unbound, and in another month with another live roundtable for DevOps Unbound. Until then, this is Alan Schimmel from Media Ops, DevOps Unbound. Have a great day, everyone, and good luck. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.